So there I was, Captain Jake Sullivan of the Terran Defense Force, standing in what can only be described as the universe's most expensive waiting room. The Galactic Council had really outdone themselves this time. Crystal walls that probably cost more than Earth's entire GDP, floating chairs that adjusted to your species' anatomy, and air that smelled suspiciously like expensive perfume mixed with disinfectant. You know, the kind of place that screams we have more money than sense and we want everyone to know it. The reason I was here? Well, apparently humanity had made quite the impression at last year's Galactic Games, and by impression I mean we accidentally turned the combat trials into what the Council now refers to as the laser cannon incident of 2387. Look, in our defense, when you tell humans there are no rules in combat, we tend to take that literally. Who knew that jury-rigging 17 different alien weapon systems into one massive death ray would be considered unsporting? But here's the kicker. This year they banned all weapons. All of them. Energy weapons, projectile weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and apparently even harsh language if it's directed at the luminal energy beings who take everything personally. The Galactic Council was very clear about this during their 3-hour presentation that could have been a 5-minute email. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary cosmic entities," announced High Arbiter Zelonius Prime, a being that looked like someone had crossed a peacock with a filing cabinet. "This year's Galactic Games will test the true mettle of our species, not through crude violence, but through the ultimate challenge of survival." And what was this ultimate challenge, you ask? 72 hours on Craxon 5, a planet that makes Australia look like a petting zoo. Everything there wants to kill you, eat you, or worse, make you fill out paperwork in triplicate. The plants are carnivorous and have developed a taste for off-world cuisine. The weather changes faster than a politician's promises, and the local wildlife considers visitors less of a threat and more of a mobile buffet. I looked around at my competition, and let me tell you, it was like showing up to a knife fight with a particularly aggressive spoon. The Zephyrins had arrived in their full cybernetic glory, looking like someone had decided that the Terminator needed more chrome and less personality. Their leader, Commander Xerok, kept flexing his titanium-enhanced muscles and making this weird clicking sound that I assume was either intimidation or really bad joint problems. Then there was the Collective, a hive-mind species that thought individuality was a character flaw. They moved in perfect synchronization, which was either really impressive or really creepy, depending on your perspective. Possibly both. Their spokesman, who went by the cheerful name of Node 7742, kept staring at me with all 6 of his eyes like I was a particularly interesting science experiment about to go wrong. And let's not forget the luminals, energy beings who existed in a constant state of barely contained smugness. They didn't even have physical forms, just sort of floated around in geometric patterns while radiating the kind of superiority complex that would make a university professor jealous. Their representative, if you could call a sentient light show a representative, called itself Radiance of Infinite Wisdom, which honestly sounded like a username someone picked when all the good ones were taken. Providing commentary for this cosmic circus was Vex Thornberry, a purple, many-eyed creature whose species had apparently evolved specifically to be annoying. He had this voice that sounded like someone was slowly deflating a balloon filled with condescension, and he was already making jokes about how humans would probably be the first ones eliminated. "And here we have the human representative," Vex announced to his viewers across the galaxy, "Captain Jake Sullivan, whose species is known for their remarkable ability to turn any situation into an opportunity for violence. Unfortunately for Captain Sullivan, violence has been removed from the equation this year. I give him 6 hours before he's begging to be evacuated. Thanks for the vote of confidence, buddy. Really feeling the love here." The best part? My handler, a bureaucratic slug named Administrator Glorbix, kept patting me on what he assumed was my shoulder with one of his slimy appendages while making these patronizing, cooing sounds. "Do not worry, small human," he wheezed through his translator. "Your species has many fine qualities. Stubbornness, for instance, and that curious habit of refusing to die when statistically you should have already. Very admirable. Very futile, but admirable nonetheless." I just smiled and nodded while mentally cataloging everything I could see. Broken ventilation grate in the corner. Some kind of crystalline debris from the fancy walls. A shoelace that had come loose from someone's boot. Standard government-issued cleaning supplies in the maintenance alcove. You know what they say about one person's trash being another person's treasure. Well, in this case, everyone else's overlooked junk was about to become my ticket to victory. But first I had to survive the next 72 hours on a planet that had apparently been designed by someone with serious anger management issues and a degree in creative homicide. This was going to be fun. If there's one thing I've learned about advanced alien civilizations, it's that they love to talk, and then talk some more about how much better they are than everyone else. It's like attending a cosmic TED Talk where every speaker thinks they invented fire. Commander Zarok decided to treat us all to a demonstration of Zephyrian superiority by flexing his cybernetic arms hard enough to dent the crystal floor. "Observe, inferior beings," he announced in a voice that sounded like gravel being processed through a blender. "The pinnacle of biological enhancement." He proceeded to lift one of the floating chairs with his pinky finger while his built-in heads-up display projected statistics about his bone density, reaction time, and apparently his breakfast preferences. "Our exoskeletons are forged from titanium-vanadium alloy," he continued, because nothing says confidence like reciting your own technical specifications. "Our neural implants process information at light speed. Our redundant life support systems make us virtually unkillable." He paused to let that sink in, then added with what I assume was meant to be menace. "Craxon 5 will be like a vacation resort for us." Node 7742 and his collective buddies weren't about to be outdone in the bragging department. They arranged themselves in some kind of geometric formation that probably had deep cultural significance, but looked like they were about to start a really weird dance routine. "Individual survival is inefficient," Node 7742 declared, speaking in perfect unison with about 30 other identical beings. "The collective shares knowledge instantaneously across all units. When one experiences danger, all adapt simultaneously. We have already calculated 17,000 possible survival scenarios and optimal responses to each." They paused, and I swear all 60 eyes focused on me at once. "The human approach of random improvisation has a success probability of 0.001%. Well, aren't they just a ray of sunshine? Radiance of infinite wisdom, not to be outdone by creatures with actual physical forms, decided to demonstrate their energy-being superiority by shape-shifting into various geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. "We transcend the limitations of matter," they proclaimed in a voice that sounded like someone tuning a radio inside a wind chime. "Physical obstacles cannot impede us. Environmental hazards pass through us harmlessly. We exist on a higher plane of existence where survival is merely a choice." Administrator Glorbix was absolutely eating this up. He was practically vibrating with excitement, which was disturbing on several levels when you're talking about a creature that resembles a 6-foot-tall garden slug. "You see, small human Jake," he wheezed, his translator crackling with what might have been emotion. "These are proper civilized species. They have evolved beyond your primitive biological limitations. They have technology, enhancement, transcendence." He gestured grandly, with a tentacle toward each group in turn. "What do humans have? Opposable thumbs and an alarming tendency toward violence." I could have explained that humans also have pattern recognition, adaptive problem-solving, and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat, even when it's mathematically inevitable. But instead, I just shrugged and said, "Yeah, we're pretty basic." This seemed to make everyone feel better about themselves, which was exactly what I was going for. While they were all busy congratulating each other on their evolutionary superiority, I was doing what humans do best, ignoring the conventional wisdom and improvising. I'd managed to casually collect that broken shoelace I'd spotted earlier, along with what looked like ordinary dirt from a decorative plant display, and some crystalline fragments that had chipped off the fancy walls. The other contestants noticed, of course. Hard to miss a guy stuffing random garbage into his pockets, but instead of being concerned, they seemed even more convinced that humanity was doomed. "Look at the primitive human," Commander Zarok observed to his cybernetic buddies. "Reduced to scavenging debris like some kind of organic waste disposal unit. The collective calculates this behavior indicates acute psychological stress," Node 77 Sarja announced. "The human's rational cognitive functions appear to be failing under pressure. This aligns with our predictions." Radiance of infinite wisdom just sort of pulsed smugly, which I assume was their version of laughing. Vex Thornberry was having a field day with the commentary. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted galactic viewers," he announced to his audience with barely contained glee, "it appears the human representative has already begun exhibiting signs of pre-competition psychological breakdown. He's currently collecting what appears to be common refuse, and talking to himself under his breath." He wasn't wrong about the talking to myself part. I was running through mental inventories, tensile strength of various materials, chemical composition of the cleaning supplies, thermal properties of the crystal fragments, you know, the usual pre-apocalypse checklist. "This is truly fascinating from an anthropological perspective," Vex continued, clearly enjoying himself. We're witnessing the exact moment when a species realizes it's completely outclassed. I predict Captain Sullivan will request emergency evacuation within the first 12 hours, assuming he survives the initial drop. Administrator Glorbix nodded sagely, his whole body rippling with what might have been wisdom or indigestion. Perhaps this will teach humanity some valuable lessons about their place in the galactic hierarchy, he mused. Sometimes the best education comes from spectacular failure. The really beautiful part was that everyone was so busy being superior that they completely missed the fact that I was taking detailed mental notes about their equipment, their weaknesses, and their psychological profiles. The Zephyrians were overconfident in their tech. The collective assumed that shared knowledge made them infallible. The Luminals believed their energy forms made them untouchable. Me? I was planning to survive the next 72 hours using dirt, a shoelace, and whatever else I could scavenge from what everyone else considered a wasteland. Because here's the thing about humans that the rest of the galaxy hasn't figured out yet. We don't just survive impossible situations, we thrive in them. And we do it using the kind of low-tech, improvised solutions that make advanced civilizations very uncomfortable. But first, I had to get to Craxon 5 and show them exactly why banning weapons was the worst mistake they could have made. The transport ship to Craxon 5 was about as comfortable as you'd expect from a government contract vessel designed by the lowest bidder. Picture a flying shoebox with all the charm of a tax audit and the interior decorating sense of someone who thinks beige is too exciting. But hey, at least it had windows, which gave us all a lovely view of our destination as we approached. Craxon 5 looked exactly like the kind of planet that would file a lawsuit against you for having the audacity to exist on its surface. From orbit, it was a swirling mass of angry clouds, lightning storms, and what appeared to be several different weather systems having a very aggressive argument with each other. The continents were a lovely shade of this-will-kill-you brown, punctuated by oceans that were probably more acid than water. Magnificent, breathed Commander Xerox, his cybernetic eyes zooming in on various surface features. Our sensors detect optimal mineral deposits for constructing fortified positions. The electromagnetic interference will not affect our hardened systems. Node 7742 was busy having what looked like a very intense telepathic conversation with the other collective members. The hive mind calculates favorable positioning coordinates, they announced. Elevated terrain with natural windbreaks and proximity to geothermal energy sources. The collective will establish a synchronized survival network within minutes of deployment. Radiance of Infinite Wisdom was doing their glowing geometric thing again. Physical geography is irrelevant to energy-based life forms, they proclaimed. We shall simply phase through any environmental obstacles, while remaining safely incorporeal. Me? I was looking at the planet and thinking it reminded me of that camping trip to Death Valley when I was 12, except with more things that wanted to eat me and significantly worse cell phone coverage. The drop pods were another masterpiece of galactic engineering, which is to say, they looked like someone had designed them specifically to make the experience as terrifying as possible, while still technically keeping you alive. We were each sealed into individual pods that would scatter us randomly across a 100-square-kilometer area of Craxon 5's most hospitable death zone. And by hospitable, I mean it would only try to kill you in 7 or 8 different ways instead of the usual dozen. Remember, announced High Arbiter Zelenius Prime over the intercom, his voice crackling with static in what might have been sadistic glee. You have 72 standard hours to survive. Emergency beacon activation will result in immediate disqualification and moderate public humiliation. Try not to die in any way that would require excessive paperwork. The countdown began, and I could see my fellow contestants making their final preparations. The Zephyrians were running diagnostic checks on their cybernetic systems. The collective was performing some kind of group meditation that looked like a very organized seizure. The Luminals were pulsing in what I assumed was their version of deep breathing exercises. And me? I was double-checking my pockets to make sure I hadn't lost any of my garbage. 10 seconds to drop, announced the ship's AI in a voice that suggested it had given up on life long ago. Good luck, and please, remember that the Galactic Council's legal department has prepared extensive documentation, absolving them of all responsibility for whatever horrible fate awaits you. The pod doors slammed shut with all the finality of a coffin lid, and suddenly I was alone in a metal box hurtling toward a planet that had apparently graduated summa cum laude from the School of Creative Homicide. The ride down was about what you'd expect from being shot out of a cannon during an earthquake while someone played death metal at maximum volume. My pod rattled, shook, and made sounds that suggested several important components were reconsidering their career choices. The external cameras gave me a lovely view of the surface rushing up to meet me at speeds that would make a physicist cry. Craxon 5's atmosphere was doing its best to dissolve my pod before I even landed, which was thoughtful of it. The air outside was a delightful cocktail of sulfur compounds, trace amounts of acid rain, and what the environmental sensors cheerfully labeled as unidentified toxic particulates. I hit the surface with all the grace of a brick being thrown by an angry gorilla. The pod bounced twice, rolled down what felt like a small mountain, and came to rest upside down in what appeared to be a puddle of something that was definitely not water. The hatch opened with a hiss that sounded distinctly apologetic, and I got my first real taste of Craxon 5's hospitality. The air was thick enough to chew and tasted like someone had mixed battery acid with expired gym socks. The temperature was fluctuating between freezing and boiling faster than a teenager's mood swings. And the local flora was already showing interest in me by reaching out with what I can only describe as very unfriendly tentacles. But here's the thing about humans that the galaxy keeps forgetting. We evolved on a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill us in creative ways. Australia alone is basically a training ground for surviving impossible situations. Compared to some of the camping trips I'd been on, Craxon 5 was just Tuesday, with slightly worse weather. I pulled myself out of the pod, oriented myself using the sun that was currently being blocked by 3 different storm systems, and started doing what humans do best, adapting. First order of business, shelter. The other species would be relying on their technology to create perfect environmental bubbles. Me? I was looking for natural cave systems, rock overhangs, or basically anything that would keep the acid rain off my head while I figured out the local ecosystem. Second, water. Not the kind that would dissolve my internal organs, preferably. Third, food. Again, preferably the kind that wouldn't immediately kill me. And fourth, figure out how to turn this nightmare landscape into my own personal advantage while everyone else's fancy technology inevitably failed them in ways their engineers never anticipated. Because that's the thing about high-tech solutions. They work great until they don't. And when they don't work on a planet like Craxon 5, they tend to fail spectacularly and at the worst possible moment. But a shoelace, some dirt, and human stubbornness, those are technologies that have been field-tested for thousands of years. Time to get to work. Now, I know what you're thinking. How does a guy with a shoelace, some dirt, and what amounts to cosmic pocket lint survive on a planet that makes the surface of Venus look like a spa resort? Well, buckle up, because you're about to get a masterclass in what happens when human stubbornness meets creative problem-solving. First things first, shelter. While I could hear the whirring and beeping of my fellow contestants setting up their high-tech survival pods in the distance, I was doing something that probably looked completely insane to anyone watching. I was digging a hole. Not just any hole, mind you. I was excavating what would become the foundation of my survival strategy, using the crystalline fragments I'd collected to create cutting tools and my bare hands to move dirt. The soil on Craxon 5 had some interesting properties that the other species were probably too sophisticated to notice. It was clay-rich, which meant it could be shaped and hardened. It had a high mineral content that would help with insulation, and best of all, it seemed to be naturally acidic, which meant it would actually neutralize some of the environmental toxins. Fascinating, came Vex Thornbury's voice, crackling through someone's communication system. The human appears to be attempting to bury himself alive. This is either a previously unknown burial ritual or evidence of complete psychological breakdown. Thanks for the commentary, Vex, really adding value here. While I was engineering my underground hideout, I could see what the advanced civilizations were up to. The Zephyrians had deployed what looked like a small military base, complete with energy shields, atmospheric processors, and enough blinking lights to power a small city. Commander Zarok was strutting around his perimeter like a cybernetic peacock, probably running diagnostics on his diagnostics. The collective had established their own version of efficiency, with all 30-something members working in perfect synchronization to create an interconnected network of shelters. It was actually kind of impressive, if you ignored the fact that they looked like the world's most organized ant farm. The Luminals had simply decided that environmental hazards were beneath them and were floating around in geometric patterns, probably discussing the meaning of existence or comparing notes on which mortals annoyed them most. But here's where things started getting interesting. About 6 hours in, Craxon 5 decided to remind everyone why it had such a charming reputation. The weather, which had been merely terrible, suddenly upgraded to apocalyptic. We're talking electromagnetic storms that could fry a satellite, temperature swings that would make a blast furnace jealous, and winds strong enough to relocate small buildings. The Zephyrians' beautiful energy shields started flickering like a dying light bulb. Turns out, all that sophisticated technology wasn't quite as hardened against electromagnetic interference as they'd thought. Commander Zarok's confident strutting quickly turned into panicked troubleshooting as his heads-up display started showing error messages in 17 different alien languages. "This is impossible," he announced to no one in particular. "Our systems are rated for Class 9 electromagnetic pulses. This interference should not be affecting us." Meanwhile, the collective was discovering that hive mind coordination gets a lot more complicated when half your network is getting scrambled by atmospheric disturbances. Instead of moving in perfect synchronization, they were starting to bump into each other and have what looked like very heated telepathic arguments. And the luminals? Well, it turns out that being made of energy has some serious drawbacks when the local environment is basically one giant electrical storm. They were getting scattered and reformed faster than a bad hologram, and their geometric patterns were starting to look more like abstract art created by someone having a seizure. Me, I was sitting in my underground bunker, staying nice and dry while using my shoelace for its intended purpose, creating snares. See, while everyone else was focused on the big picture survival stuff, I'd been paying attention to the local ecosystem. Kraxon 5 wasn't just a lifeless rock trying to kill visitors. It was actually teeming with life, just not the kind that would win any beauty contests. There were these small, rat-like creatures that seemed to thrive in the toxic environment. They were fast, they were clever, and they were absolutely everywhere. Using the shoelace, some of those crystal fragments, and a basic understanding of animal behavior, I'd managed to set up a series of snares around my shelter. Within a few hours, I had caught 3 of the local critters, which, after some very careful field testing, turned out to be not only edible, but actually pretty nutritious. "Extraordinary," came Vex's voice again, now sounding distinctly less smug. "The human appears to have constructed primitive hunting devices and is now consuming local fauna. This is either remarkably adaptive behavior or evidence of severe desperation. Both, actually, but thanks for noticing. But the real genius wasn't in the hunting, it was in the pottery. Remember that useless dirt I'd been collecting? Mixed with water from my purification setup, which was basically a solar still made from crystal fragments and pod materials, it became clay. And clay, when properly shaped and fired using the planet's own geothermal activity, becomes ceramic containers, perfect for water storage and food preparation. I'd basically turned Kraxon 5's hostile geology into my personal kitchen. The other contestants were starting to notice that something was wrong with their perfect plans. The Zephyrians were burning through their backup power supplies, trying to keep their environmental systems online. The collective was fragmenting, as individual members started making independent survival decisions, and the luminals were spending so much energy maintaining cohesion in the electromagnetic storms that they were becoming visibly dimmer. But the real kicker came when the planet decided to throw us a curveball in the form of carnivorous plant life. The local flora, which had seemed merely aggressive before, apparently viewed the electromagnetic storms as dinner time. These things looked like a cross between a Venus flytrap and a bear trap, except they were mobile, they hunted in packs, and they had developed a taste for off-world technology. The Zephyrians found this out the hard way, when a pack of the things surrounded their base and started systematically dismantling their energy shields. Turns out, the plants were attracted to electromagnetic signatures, and all that beautiful high-tech equipment was basically ringing a dinner bell. Commander Zarok's confident boasting turned into panicked radio chatter as his people found themselves fighting a siege they hadn't prepared for. "This was not in the planetary survey data," he announced, which I assume was Zephyrian for "we're in serious trouble here." The collective wasn't faring much better. The plants seemed to view their telepathic network as some kind of buffet, disrupting their mental connections and causing chaos in their carefully coordinated survival strategy. Even the luminals were having problems. The plants might not be able to eat energy directly, but they were apparently capable of interfering with energy being coherence patterns, which was causing the luminals to experience what I can only describe as cosmic indigestion. And me? Well, I'd figured out something interesting about the local flora. They were attracted to technology and electromagnetic signatures, but they seemed to actively avoid certain areas with high concentrations of the naturally acidic soil. Areas like, I don't know, the underground shelter I'd built using local materials and camouflaged with native dirt. It was almost like the planet's ecosystem had evolved natural defenses against its own predators, and all you had to do was pay attention and work with the environment instead of against it. By the 36-hour mark, I wasn't just surviving on Craxon 5, I was actually getting comfortable. My shelter was secure, I had a reliable food and water source, and I'd even managed to create a basic workshop using salvaged materials and natural resources. The other contestants? They were starting to look like they'd been through a blender set to cosmic horror. But the real test was still coming. Because Craxon 5 had saved its best surprise for last. And this one was going to separate the survivors from the statistics. Hour 68. 4 hours to go until the end of the competition, and Craxon 5 decided it was time for the grand finale. Because apparently, electromagnetic storms, carnivorous plants, and toxic atmosphere weren't quite dramatic enough for a planet with serious overachiever issues. The ground started shaking first. Not the gentle, oops, minor seismic activity kind of shaking, but the planet is having an existential crisis variety that makes you question your life choices and wonder if your insurance covers acts of geological revenge. I felt it through the walls of my underground shelter before I heard it, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the planet's core. Within minutes, what had been merely hostile terrain was transforming into an active geological nightmare. Fissures opened up across the landscape, spewing superheated gases, and what I can only describe as very angry magma. The other contestants were not having a good time. The Zephyrian's high-tech base, which had been struggling with plant attacks and electromagnetic interference, suddenly found itself sitting directly on top of what was becoming a very enthusiastic volcano. Commander Zarok's tactical superiority evaporated faster than water on a hot sidewalk as his people scrambled to relocate their equipment while dodging lava flows and toxic gas clouds. "Emergency protocols activated," came Zarok's increasingly panicked transmissions. "Base relocation in progress. Repeat, we are evacuating to secondary position," which in military speak translates to, "We're running for our lives and hoping our cybernetic legs are faster than molten rock." The collective was fragmenting, in the most literal sense. Their carefully coordinated network was breaking apart as individual members were cut off from each other by the expanding fissure system. Half of them were trapped on one side of a lava flow, while the other half were dealing with toxic gas emissions that were interfering with their telepathic connections. Watching a hive mind have a nervous breakdown is both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Node 7742 kept broadcasting updates that were getting progressively more incoherent. Collective efficiency at 67% and falling. Network synchronization compromised. Individual survival protocols engaging. And then, in what might have been the first independent thought any of them had ever had, "This is not going according to plan." The Luminals were discovering that energy beings have some serious limitations when the local environment starts producing massive electromagnetic pulses from geological activity. They were flickering in and out of existence like a bad neon sign, and their usual geometric smugness had been replaced by what I can only describe as existential panic. "Matter-based existence is looking surprisingly appealing right now," came Radiance of Infinite Wisdom's increasingly unstable transmission. "Physical form provides unexpected advantages in geological catastrophes." And me? Well, I was having what you might call a moment of inspiration. See? While everyone else was focused on escaping the geological chaos, I was noticing something interesting about the pattern of seismic activity. The fissures weren't random. They were following specific geological stress lines, creating a network of natural channels that were directing the flow of both lava and toxic gases. And if you knew how to read the terrain, which I'd spent the last 68 hours learning to do, you could predict where the safe zones would be. More importantly, I could see exactly where my fellow contestants were going to end up if they kept running in the directions they were currently headed. And it wasn't anywhere good. Commander Zarok and his remaining Zephyrians were retreating toward what looked like high ground, but was actually the drainage path for the expanding lava system. The scattered collective members were heading for what appeared to be stable terrain, but was actually sitting on top of a massive gas pocket that was about to become very unstable very quickly, and the Luminals were trying to phase through what they thought was solid rock, not realizing it was actually a thin crust over a magma chamber. In about 20 minutes, they were all going to be in situations that would make their previous problems look like minor inconveniences. Now, I could have just stayed in my perfectly safe underground bunker, waited out the remaining 4 hours and claimed victory by default when everyone else either got evacuated or became geological statistics. It would have been the smart play, the logical choice. But here's the thing about humans that really confuses the rest of the galaxy. Sometimes we do stupid, heroic things just because they're the right thing to do. I grabbed my emergency supplies, basically everything I'd managed to create or salvage during my stay on Craxon 5, and headed out into the geological nightmare to stage what was probably the galaxy's first search and rescue mission using primitive technology and spite. First stop, the Zephyrians. I found Commander Zarok and 3 of his people trapped on a plateau that was rapidly being surrounded by lava flows. Their cybernetic enhancements were overheating in the extreme temperatures, and their environmental suits were failing faster than campaign promises. "Human," Zarok called out when he saw me approaching, his voice distorted by equipment failures. "What are you doing here? This area will be uninhabitable within minutes." "Yeah, I know," I called back, unrolling the rope I'd improvised from plant fibers and Shoelace. "That's why we need to get you out of there. Catch this and tie it around something solid." What followed was probably the most undignified rescue in galactic history, involving 4 highly advanced cyborgs being pulled to safety by a human using equipment that wouldn't have been out of place in a Stone Age survival manual. But it worked, and within 10 minutes I had the Zephyrians relocated to a genuinely stable position, where their technology could actually function. Next up, the Collective. Half of them were cut off on an island that was rapidly shrinking as the lava flows converged. The other half were on the far side, trying to maintain telepathic contact across a gap that was expanding by the minute. This one required a bit more creativity. Using the ceramic containers I'd made from local clay, along with some basic chemistry involving the planet's natural gas emissions, I managed to create a series of small explosions that redirected one of the lava flows, creating a temporary land bridge that lasted just long enough for the separated collective members to reunite. Node 77's words when they re-established mental connection were, "The human survival methodology defies all logical parameters, yet demonstrates remarkable effectiveness." Finally, there were the Luminals. They were trapped in a situation that was uniquely problematic for energy beings. They were caught in the electromagnetic field generated by the geological activity, unable to maintain coherence long enough to escape to a stable area. This one required me to get creative with the planet's own geology. Using my understanding of the mineral composition and electromagnetic properties of the local rock formations, I managed to create a kind of electromagnetic channel using crystal formations positioned at key points. It was basically building a lightning rod system that gave the Luminals a path of least resistance to follow to safety. Radiance of Infinite Wisdom's gratitude was expressed through a light show that probably would have been beautiful if I hadn't been too busy making sure we all didn't become geological casualties. By the time the 72-hour mark hit, I had not only survived Craxon 5's best efforts to kill me, but I'd managed to rescue every other contestant using nothing but improvised tools, basic scientific principles, and what Administrator Glorbix would later describe as impossible human stubbornness. The rescue ships arrived to find all contestants alive, accounted for, and gathered in the one stable area of the test zone that I'd identified using dirt, a shoelace, and what the official report would classify as unorthodox but effective survival methodology. Vex Thornburg's final commentary pretty much summed up the galaxy's confusion. In a stunning turn of events, the contestant everyone expected to fail first has not only survived, but apparently rescued all other participants using what can only be described as primitive technology and questionable decision-making. This reporter is at a complete loss for words. Finally, something we could agree on. The award ceremony took place back on the Galactic Council's fancy space station in the same crystal-walled waiting room where this whole adventure had started. Except now, instead of condescending speeches about human inferiority, there was a lot of very uncomfortable silence, and what I can only describe as bureaucratic confusion on an intergalactic scale. High Arbiter Zelenys Prime stood at the podium, holding the victory medal like it might bite him. His peacock filing cabinet appearance seemed somehow deflated, as if someone had let the air out of his superiority complex. The prepared speech he'd obviously written about the triumph of advanced civilization over primitive biology was clearly not going to work anymore. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted galactic entities," he began, his voice lacking its usual pompous confidence. "We are here to celebrate the conclusion of this year's Galactic Games Survival Challenge." He paused, looking down at his notes like they were written in a language he'd never seen before. "The winner, by virtue of being the only participant to complete the full 72-hour challenge without requiring emergency evacuation, is Captain Jake Sullivan of Earth." The polite applause from the galactic dignitaries sounded like someone clapping with oven mitts on. Very confused, very reluctant oven mitts. Commander Zarok, whose cybernetic enhancements were still showing signs of the repairs from our Craxon 5 adventure, stepped forward. "High Arbiter, if I may," he said, his voice module crackling slightly. "The human's methodology defied all conventional survival doctrine. He used tools and techniques that our military academies would classify as obsolete by several thousand years. And yet," I pointed out, "here we all are, alive and unburned by lava, thanks to those obsolete techniques." Node 7742, speaking for the collective, added their own confusion to the mix. "Our post-analysis calculations indicate that the human success probability should have remained at 0.001% throughout the entire challenge. We cannot reconcile the observed outcomes with known survival parameters." Radiance of infinite wisdom pulsed in what I was learning to recognize as their version of a philosophical headache. The material-based life form demonstrated capabilities that transcend our understanding of primitive biological limitations. This challenges fundamental assumptions about the hierarchy of evolved consciousness. Administrator Glorbix was practically vibrating with bewilderment, which was deeply unsettling to watch. "Small human Jake," he wheezed, "your species continues to confound all reasonable expectations. You survived using dirt and string. This should not be possible." "Actually, it was dirt, string, and about 10,000 years of human trial and error learning," I corrected, "plus a basic understanding of chemistry, geology, biology, and the kind of stubborn refusal to die that comes from evolving on a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill us in creative ways." Vex Thornbury, who had spent the entire competition predicting my immediate doom, was struggling to provide commentary for his galactic audience. "Viewers, what we witnessed on Craxon 5 represents a fundamental challenge to our understanding of survival methodology. The human approach, which this reporter initially described as doomed to spectacular failure, proved not only effective but superior to advanced technological solutions." He paused, and I could practically hear him wrestling with his worldview. "This reporter is forced to conclude that there may be aspects of primitive survival techniques that modern civilizations have overlooked in their pursuit of technological advancement." High Arbiter Zelenes Prime finally managed to pull himself together enough to present the medal. It was a beautiful piece of work, all crystalline complexity and precious metals that probably cost more than most planets' GDP. He placed it around my neck with the kind of expression you'd have if you were handing a loaded weapon to someone you didn't trust. "Captain Sullivan," he said formally, "the Galactic Council recognizes your unprecedented achievement in completing the survival challenge, using, unconventional methodologies." "Thank you," I replied, then decided to give them something to really think about. "You know, this whole competition was based on the idea that banning weapons would level the playing field. But here's the thing about humans that you might want to write down somewhere. We don't just use weapons. We turn everything into weapons." I held up the shoelace that had started this whole adventure. "This isn't just string. In the right hands, it's a snare, a measuring device, a rope, a tourniquet, or a garrote. That dirt wasn't just soil. It was camouflage, building material, chemical neutralizer, and pottery clay." I gestured toward the crystal fragments I still had in my pocket. "Those weren't just debris. They were cutting tools, optical lenses, and electromagnetic channeling devices. The silence in the room was so thick you could have cut it with one of my improvised crystal knives. You banned our weapons," I continued, "so we turned everything else into weapons. The planet itself became our equipment. The hostile environment became our ally. Even the other contestants became part of our survival strategy when we decided that keeping everyone alive was more important than winning alone." Commander Zarok's cybernetic eyes were probably running calculations on how many everyday objects could potentially be weaponized by a sufficiently motivated human. The number was probably making his processors overheat. "Next time," I said, looking directly at High Arbiter Zelenes Prime, "maybe ban our creativity too. Of course, good luck figuring out how to do that without banning intelligence itself." The awards ceremony concluded with what might have been the most uncomfortable official photograph in galactic history. Me, grinning with a medal around my neck, surrounded by alien dignitaries who looked like they'd just discovered that their supposedly primitive neighbors had been secretly capable of intergalactic conquest all along, but had just been too polite to mention it. As I was leaving, Administrator Glorbix sidled up to me with that expression that bureaucrats get when they're trying to figure out how to spin a disaster into a learning opportunity. "Small human Jake," he said, his translator crackling with what might have been nervous energy. "Perhaps the Galactic Council would be interested in consulting with your species on, alternative survival methodologies for future challenges." I just smiled. "Sure, we'd be happy to help. Fair warning, though. Our teaching methods tend to be very hands-on. Hope you're not afraid of getting dirty." The look of horror that crossed his slimy features was absolutely priceless. And that, ladies and gentlemen of the galaxy, is how humanity went from being the cosmic underdogs to the species that everyone realized they probably shouldn't underestimate. Not because we're the strongest, or the smartest, or the most technologically advanced, but because when you take away our weapons, we just get creative, and human creativity, as the Galactic Council was about to learn, is the most dangerous weapon of all.